Hi, this is Aaron Azrod, and welcome to the 112th episode of the Truth Island podcast. In light of recent events with the stock market and questions surrounding inequality, the more fundamental question that needs to be answered is, are we as humans inherently selfish? Richard Dawkins, in his 1976 book, The Selfish Gene, postulates that in some instances, selfishness might be an inherited trait, which increases the chances of human survival in an almost Darwinian sense. Dawkins begins by outlining that genes, which serve an organism's implicit interest, are more likely to be passed in successive generations. Dawkins further adds that acts of altruism and collective group efforts are merely an occurrence to preserve one's individual survival, but tend to fall apart once a group's interest negates the survival of each individual. Dawkins' book, in many respects, contradicted earlier ideas that good societies tended to be corrupted by especially selfish individuals, but rather suggests that inherent selfishness exists within each of us, but is curbed by mutual alliances that ensure reproductive success and transference of genetic material. In many respects, these ideas contradict earlier religious notions of altruistic sacrifice, belief in a higher purpose, or attaining higher levels of understanding in which the ego and self are no longer of paramount importance. In recent times, with growing income and wealth inequality, one can't help but wonder if perhaps everyone is simply maximizing their reproductive chances and if absolutely no one even cares about the collective march of humanity. Joining me to help us become hopefully a bit less selfish, I am once again joined by Alexander. Alex, I'm going to start off by asking you a question. When riding the bus or subway, what percentage of the time do you give up the seat to someone that was in need?
If it's a female, 100% of the time. If it's a male, I say, this is my seat. There's nothing you can do to get it. That's just a competitive nature in me. But no, I usually give up my seat, truly. Like if somebody's exhausted, they've worked a long shift, maybe it's early in the morning for me, but it's late in the night for them. And they've just come back from working at the Standard Hotel, which I've done for quite some time, my early days in New York. They're exhausted. They need the seat. So, give it to them. It's all well and good. You can stand for 30 more seconds to get to your next stop. But if it's a pregnant woman, I get so upset when people don't get up because they give you the eyes, right? They give you the Bambi eyes. Like, please, are you a normal human being?
Yeah, and I think that we instinctually, I talked about this on another podcast, that we instinctually know who is truly deserving of things and who is not. I've noticed in New York when someone comes into a subway with a walker or a cane or a pregnant lady, they will always find a seat. They will absolutely always find a seat. But I think it's okay to be, if you're a guy on the train and you've had a
Mhm.
long, hard day of work and, you look at someone else and you're just like, well, I'm just as exhausted as this dude. Where like it's a judgment call, right? And I've probably made the judgment call from time to time to be like, hey, I'm just as tired as this guy. I'm staying put right here. I ask this question as I think it's a good way. When we think of selfishness, we always go to
Mhm.
the absolute top and be like, oh, well, the common proletariat people are just good-hearted, warm, fuzzy creatures all around. And it's this evil, rich cabal of rich people that are holding us down. And I'm like, well, I think we need to first look at selfishness within ourselves as individuals, because I
Mhm.
think selfishness, occurs at every strata. It occurs
Right.
between siblings, or it occurs between husband and wife. The most cited reason for divorce are issues over money. So like I think that this happens sadly, both on the micro level and on the macro level. And I want to go to Dawkins' like theory, and I kind of want to talk like, is he right that it's in our genetic interest to just be selfish and only be good when it's self-serving? It's a fair question to ask.
It is a fair question to ask, but I think that he's hitting it a little bit with a blunt instrument, in my opinion. I would argue that genetically speaking, we've gotten to where we are because we weren't solely selfish. I mean, just the rise of civilization was the first occasion that we started to plant, work together to choose who tills the fields, when to harvest, when not to harvest. Can we all work together on this? So now we're here. Now we have skyscrapers and airplanes that fly across the globe. So to say that we're genetically wired to be only selfish is just a little bit blunt. I
Hmm.
do believe, however, we are genetically wired to be self-possessed, which is a little bit different in my mind. Selfish implies like a morality of choice, whereas self-possessed is a little bit more of survival driver, right? For example, if you're on an airplane and the masks come down, they instruct you first to put your mask on first so you can assist others. And I think that these links in this chain of this conversation of what is selfishness is an important thing to look at, because I always found people who are the most selfish are usually the ones that fall into two categories. One, people who are unable to be comfortable out of control when things are out of control, and to sit in that and be comfortable in the out of control. And also those that have an innate desire to be in control. So I think whenever there's a disproportionate lack of character in those two categories, almost like two parts of the piston to the engine that drives it, that's when, selfishness in the morality sense really takes a kicker.
I think that's really brilliant, Alex. I do see this because I also, borrowing a quote from our friend Yoda, I see a lot of selfishness kind of surrounded in fear. I see this like fear of like, I have to start like, because we think about why people start hoarding resources. Let's just really think about it. They think that there's not going to be enough. And what's interesting about wealthy people is that you'll notice that they don't just hoard money, they also hoard cans of soup. They also build bomb shelters. They also build other ridiculous things that they think is going to are going to save them. And I'm like asking myself, okay, is it that they are just inherently selfish? And when you actually look further, I see that fear. There's that fear of like, all of these bad things are going to happen to me. I need to have 1,000 cans of soup in a bomb shelter for when the apocalypse happens and so forth. And what I see is like really fear of death, fear of that really kind of driving a lot of this behavior. And I think to add on to your point about uncertainty, I think the more comfortable you become with the idea of death, the less selfish you actually become.
Well, that's definitely a fact. The more comfortable you become with death, I think the more enlightened you become just as a person. But the example of the wealthy following through with extreme tactics is an extreme facet of the wealthy group. I grew up with a lot of amazing wealthy people who did none of that. And they were some of the most normal, generous, open minded, creative people I've ever come across, simply because they're not under the yoke of poverty, right? They have
Mm,
the ability to have extra time. I mean, even history explains this, right? If you're a person of wealth, and you're working in the army, you're able to afford better armor. So it's just there's this social climbing aspect to being wealthy that opens up opportunities for the arts or for decadence or for whatever. So again, this brings it right back to being self-possessed. If I was flat broke and had absolutely nothing, no place to stay, no money in my account, no car, no ID, nothing, I'd be pretty selfish. I'd be pretty selfish because I gotta have myself eat. I mean, this is what's tapping into that monkey brain of ours, which is we have to survive. We have to survive. And there's also another side of this coin, which I find interesting, especially with the wealthy, since we brought them up. They are providing, one person is providing for a certain branch of their family tree. And their success is tied into their ability to maintain the happiness and the lifestyle. However, we might look at that as, let's choose a different word than grotesque, completely different, right? Aristocratic, let's say. They still need to provide for that. So when it comes down to it, they feel that they are protecting theirs,
right. Yes.
their people, and therefore they might choose to do something selfish. But I think all of this stems down to an essential problem, which is that humanity doesn't view humanity as equal. Humanity puts a hierarchy structure on them and says, these people are a waste of space. They're not going anywhere. They're just going to take what's mine. I need to eliminate that problem to increase the abundance of what I have.
Now, there's a very interesting study that was performed years ago, and I'm going to butcher this study, but the gist of it is that there is like the macro hierarchy, like ultra wealthy, middle class, shrinking middle class, poor, and so forth. But there's also a local hierarchy that each of us creates. For example, people tend to value their family more than they do just random strangers. So even within
Yes.
each family unit, there's a hierarchy there. Like I value my son more than someone else's son. And this has been
Mhm.
tested out where they have shown that like, I think there was like a classic example of like, imagine there's like a burning building, right? And your son is in one building and someone else's son is in another
Mhm.
building. Who do you save? Do you save your own son or do you save some random dude's son? And obviously, overwhelmingly, people will choose to save their own kin. Like
Mhm.
if they had to choose. So we have this like preference system to what's closer to us, what
Right.
looks like us, what feels like us, what we think will protect us, and so forth. And I think that probably has some kind of genetic callback, like my
Yeah.
like the father's instantly saying to himself, well, that son represents me, that son represents my genetic material right there, and I can't let that genetic material fade away. So there's even that local programming that we have to contend with.
Yeah. And the beauty of this is that most of humanity is empathetic enough to look at that situation as tragic.
Yeah.
Whereas in the wild kingdom, they may not have that level of empathy. I mean, some may argue otherwise, or they don't have the opportunity to express that empathy. So that decision is a very clear decision to the animal kingdom. It just feels morally, or more so, morally strained for us. But the whole reason we have that hierarchy structure is so we can make good decisions. So, this is getting into the conversation of making harder choices. Is that a selfish thing to do? And I don't think so. There's just only so much order we can bring to this level of chaos. And unfortunately, sometimes that means making selfish decisions for the betterment of the whole. I mean, I wrote a children's book about this.
Hmm.
About the environment, and how if the environment of your worldly surroundings isn't a healthy environment, then you have to make a change. And sometimes that involves two people moving on for the sake of each other's environment. There's a relativity conversation here.
Yes, yes. There is precedent for this, and again, a lot of people are like, man, we don't need religion anymore. But hold the phone right there, because religion does actually have an answer to this. And I think it comes in the form of Abraham and his son Isaac, where, even God at some point tells you like, hey man, to save humanity, you might have to like kill your son. Like it actually, like in that story, it kind of embodies that. And then the last second, God stops him from doing it. But there is this like idea that is being almost hinted in religion, that there is a level almost of transcendence in which we are expected, or it would be desired for us to come, where we're even like, man, I am so dedicated to getting this species moving forward that I will sacrifice my, and then it's continued onward, I think, with the story of Jesus, who sacrifices
Mhm.
himself and so forth. So this idea of like altruistic sacrificing, both of the family unit, and then in the embodiment of Jesus in the individual unit, kind of really promotes this idea. And like I said, do I think it's realistic that people are going to get to that enlightened level? Absolutely not. Like we're not anywhere close to doing that. But I think that there's some, if you read these stories and you kind of follow it, let's say you follow it like to 5% or 10% to that kind of idealism, then you
Mhm.
could say to yourself, you know what, man, I should donate 20% of my income or something. That's not as bad as
Mhm.
like sacrificing my son or something crazy like that. So I,
Right.
I I think that we have thrown the baby away with the bathwater, in the sense that we're like, man, we're science all the way, Dawkins, selfish gene, that's the answer here. But I'm like, look at what we've lost here. We've kind of lost that fundamental level of compassion, and this ideal of, I think altruism is something that we may or may not ever achieve. But I think that we've thrown away even the pursuit of altruism, and that's the most dangerous thing.
Hmm.
We've just given up. I'm like, we're never going to be that. Let's just give up. And I'm like, we need to return to at least aiming to be altruistic. I'm not saying we're going to get there, but at least walking in that path.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if that would be a good choice. Really trying to grow into being altruistic in totality. More altruistic, 100%.
Yeah.
Totally altruistic, I don't see that working. I don't. And, maybe it's because I'm a little more selfish than you. That's possible. Or maybe it's because I'm a little bit more of a cynic in this example. But there is one core problem with this is that you can be as altruistic as you want. But if the other half of whom you're being altruistic towards decides to fudge it up, there's nothing you can do, and your efforts are in vain. So the question is working to be anti-selfish or to be fully altruistic, does that operationally work? Does that work operationally?
I think if it's done on an incremental basis, again, like what
Oh,
I'm not on this show advocating we all need to become like Jesus tomorrow or something like that. I'm not going that far and saying, but I think that we have to get back on the incremental step ladder of
yes.
altruistic behavior. And again, like I'm really, really moderate and really slow on this. Just very simple things, very simple things. And something as simple as that is like, hey, I'm going to help somebody that's in need. It's a rich person saying,
Yes.
hey, I'm okay with my taxes going from 38% to 46% or something. That's not sacrificing the family farm, right? It's not sacrificing everything. It's a small little incremental thing, a small incremental gesture that you're doing that shows, hey, I kind of care about myself and my family, but I also care about this like greater organism of humanity that we're all a part of. And I
Hmm.
think that's the kind of goal. So again, if you take the most radicalized version of this, it's going to fail. I agree with you. But if you implement it on an incremental basis, then I think it's at least worth looking at.
Oh yeah. Yeah, we need that. There's so much pain out there right now that can be easily solved with just basic changes.
Yeah.
And, I don't know if I could call that altruistic, but maybe it's an element of the pursuit of altruism, right? Where we're just getting better and better, incremental change, just as you said. Yes, we
Hmm.
need that. We absolutely need that. I mean, the whole pole of the rising current, what seems to be like the aristocracy pulling away from those who don't even have basic needs, or those in other opposite countries that don't have medical supplies or a roof over their head. Like all of this is easily solvable on some level.
Hmm. Hmm.
The reason why we don't do it, that's totally up for debate. Dawkins says it's genetic. I think it's just purely competition that assists the overall objective. And I know that's like kind of a gross explanation, but if you're stacking more resources into a straight line, you get there quicker. And I know that's disgusting, but I think this is what they think. I think that why would I move out of my way to assist this one spot when I get nothing in return to accomplish my objective? And because we're all trying to kill each other, which is the whole reason there are borders, it's almost like a live or die situation.
So I talked about this on a previous podcast with my friend Joe, and the goal of it, and people ask, well, what's in it for the rich, right? Like, why should they pay higher taxes? There are, like, what's in for them? Suppose they're just sociopaths, right? Like, let's just pretend for a second they're pure sociopaths. They only care about themselves. Well, it's like, do you really want to be king of an ant colony? And that's a fair thing. And studies have shown that in countries when you think of the developing world or the third world, countries where there's extreme levels of income inequality, the wealthy are not happy at all. They're actually quite miserable. They live in gated communities, but they have no freedom. If they leave their gated community, they're at risk of being assassinated or something. They have to be surrounded by bodyguards at all times. They have a very small radius in which they're able to walk and a small radius in which they're able to operate. And they're actually, like, even though they're wealthy relative to the people starving in their country, they're actually a lot poorer than rich people in more developed countries and more freer
Hmm.
nations, because basically, people in America become wealthy not just selling things to other wealthy people, because, how many yachts can you buy? How many houses can you buy? How many, mansions can you own? They actually get wealthy selling stuff to us, the folk, right? And there's this idea that if people are so bloody poor, it actually hurts your own survival. It hurts your own protection. All of these regimes where you have oligarchs or you have power concentrated into a few hands, there is constant assassination attempts. There's constant
Right.
military coups and all this other kind of ridiculous stuff. So my argument is that if you're a really rich person and just down to the core pretty darn selfish, your own survival is at stake if you
Right.
allow the rest of humanity to rot.
Right. And not even just your survival, but the survival of the unborn to come within your family. I mean, part of this is like people who become immensely successful, a lot of the times they come from nothing. They have absolutely dire situations and then they pull themselves through that to become successful. Now, that's not 100%. That's probably a small portion, but they exist. They understand. If I'm not leaving something for my kids, they're going to have to go through that shit twice. Why does that make sense? Am I building this to assist other people, or am I building this just to get myself out? And I think honestly, a lot of the times they build it to help the unborn generations within their family to come to have a situation better than the last. Is that selfish? Is it selfish for me to go into competition with everyone else on this planet to make sure that my kid goes to a good school?
I think I'm going to answer that question. I would be lying. Every parent owes it to send their child to the best possible school and give
Mm-hmm.
them the best possible opportunities. And I would be a complete liar if I said otherwise. Like if you have the resources to give your kids a leg up in this world, please, by all means, do it. Where it becomes selfish is when that leg up is undeserved. And I think we kind of see this a little bit in like the cheating scandals with the Ivy Leagues. We see this, like, for example, if I just arbitrarily appoint my son, who's completely incompetent, as the next CEO of my company, and he doesn't deserve to be there, he doesn't have the mental acumen or the motivation to be there, well, then I'm kind of doing a disservice. Like, I've given my child all of the opportunities, all of the opportunities to be something. But if I just arbitrarily appoint them to some position of power,
Right.
I'm not really taking care of them in a way. I'm actually doing them a huge disservice by just really taking up space, because ultimately they're going to wreck that company. Ultimately, they're going to squander whatever opportunities I give. And ultimately, I'm actually, see, here's the thing is that I think wealthy people make this mistake of thinking that you're taking care of your child just in a monetary sense. Like, that's how you take care of a child. You just buy them stuff. If you just buy them enough stuff, you're taking care of them. But what about their spirit? You have to
Mm-hmm.
take care, you have to cultivate a child's spirit. And the only way to cultivate a child's spirit is through hardship. If the child never goes through any hardship or doesn't overcome things or doesn't accomplish things or overcome obstacles, well, you may have monetarily taken care of them, but you have kind of not taking care of their spirit, which is why you kind of see this phenomena of the children of wealthy sometimes being addicted to drugs and all sorts of stuff like that, because the spirit was not cultivated.
Right. But I've seen it done. I've seen very wealthy people surrounded by scumbaggery of wealthy people still raise their kids to have all of that, and the blanket of being privileged enough to not be concerned. I've seen it happen. Is it rarer than it is common? Probably, yes, probably, just from my personal experience, but it is entirely possible. Part of the dilemma is that the American character thinks that in order to be a great person, you have to be shaped by your external forces and then rise above within. Whereas it's a more Eastern philosophy that the power is within. What you change from within changes your external. So
Mm-hmm.
the whole concept that it's like, oh, you're born from privilege, your parents have some wealth, you're not able to overcome the same trials and tribulations. That I don't know if I necessarily agree with that. I think it's more likely that someone with a silver spoon in their mouth won't have the character to come through, but it's really just about how you appropriate life experience in general. If you're appropriating life experience to your progeny just through your money, through the assets that you own, and through the grandeur of what life you've built, then you've already failed and you've built a husk of a human being.
Right.
But if you sit them down and say, these are the principles, the core principles that I've struggled through day in, day out, and as long as you follow this basic plan, everything else will fall into place.
Now this is very interesting, and I agree with you, and I think that from what I've read, the people that have the wealthy people that have raised successful children have done so in such a way where they kind of almost pretend to be poor in a sense. Like, it's hard, like obviously they live in big houses and so forth, but they kind of pretend to just be like, man, I can't buy you that, I can't afford that. Or they kind of just put on this like very modest act of like, sorry, I can't buy you that Lamborghini at 16 or whatever. And they kind of like give what they kind of create this like fiat, or this like this fake sense of like, you have to kind of earn this on your own. And what that does is that teaches the child
Mhm.
some level of responsibility. They may even make their kid get a part-time job over the summer, or volunteer or do something. So they're still getting, the private school education. If they get accepted into an Ivy League school, someone's still, basically paying the bill for that. So they're getting the privileges, but they're just not getting all of the senseless materialistic luxuries that they're just not entitled to. And that's, I think, like the dividing line where we want to think of this. It's like, if you want to take care of your kids, yes, if there's some way that money can help, I get it. I
Mhm.
100% I get that, and I get it as 100%. But you want your child to also go through hardship, and you also want them to go through some tears, and you want them to go. I think a good example of this, what's her name? I think her name is Amy Chow. She wrote a book called Tiger Mom. She's like a law professor at Harvard, at Yale rather. And she says like, hey, I don't buy my kids anything. I don't buy them video games. I treat them as if they're poor, even though we're pretty well off. And that's like an idea of cultivating character. But I guess like
Mhm.
the point I'm trying to make here is that with this, I'm not saying that we can ever kind of train people to like put other people's kin first. I think that's a really hard thing to accomplish. But we need to
Mhm.
start being aware of like, does my child fundamentally deserve what it is that I am setting up for them? If my child is exceptionally smart and deserves to be in this position in life, fair enough. But I think parents need to be honest with themselves and say, hey, I love you. I love you so much, my son, my daughter. But this working class kid kind of deserves to be at Harvard right now and not you. And I think that's a fair thing to say for every parent. I don't think you're feeding your own kid to the wolves by just being fundamentally honest with yourself.
Right. Being honest with yourself and honest with your kid is, I think, different than saying if they deserve or not. And here's why. I think that reinforcing that structure, whether someone is deserving, when you're outside of that individual who happen to be born into a certain set of circumstances, which may or may not be different if they were in a different body sleeve somewhere else in the world, speaking a different language, feeling a different religion. And I worry that this whole desperation to instill in a privileged born child the very things that got that first individual to that level, that can create some strange abuse structures where it's like, you're not amounting to what you have to do to get where I am. You don't deserve this.
Mhm.
And then, because this scale of the y on a graph, right, which is up and down, the scale of the y is so much further that they have to reach. It's a higher frequency that they have to reach, that now the undeserving aspects of yourself, even if it's not your fault, even if you haven't matured in a certain way yet, but you will, you start to feel that you don't deserve anything. And maybe that's when a parent says you don't deserve anything. And for those reasons,
Right.
psychologically, because I don't believe you deserve any of this. You deserve nothing. You're less than what I've done. And that's a struggle too. And I wonder if this is where a lot of this, oh, my rich dad beats me in secret kind of stereotype comes from, right? Where it's like the dad's like, how do I show you that you're being this sniveling little worm that isn't going to succeed? I have to force you to see this now for your own good. It's like
No,
that's a
I
common sentiment.
I hear you, man, and I think that what this comes down to is I think the parent ultimately has to say to themselves, I've made my choices in life to start this company, to do whatever, and I just love my children for who they are. I think that
Right.
that is something that every parent needs to say. And even if even if their child goes off the beaten path or does whatever it is that they feel is right, you just love them the same. And I think again, and I think it goes back to what you said really in the beginning of this podcast, is that those who are the most selfish also have the desire to control. They have
Right.
this desire to control everything around them, including their loved ones. They want
Right.
their loved ones to fit a specific mold that is specific to their vision, even. It's specific, like they're because the parent is thinking about their own dynastic cycle. The parent is thinking about their dynastic cycle and saying, "I want the child to continue this dynastic lineage that I have set forth." And there is some degree of selfishness in that, where the parent has to say, "Hey,
Right.
I knocked it out of the park. I hit some home runs out here." It's ultimately it's kind of like I have to kind of embrace that uncertainty and embrace that these forces are out of my control, and that my child will do whatever it is that they feel is right, and all I can do is support them, and all I can really do is kind of just embrace them for who they are. And I think you're right, man. I think this
Mhm.
desire for fear and control causes the worst in us. It absolutely does.
It's so funny because that you brought that up because this morning we were having a conversation about the Mary Trump book, which detailed some of the of her opinion of why Donald Trump is who he is and what psychoanalytic forces molded his personality, in her opinion. And a lot of it stems from exactly what we're talking about, which is a father saying, "You don't deserve to feel that way. You don't deserve to act that way. You do what
Mm,
I need you to do." And look at look at what happened. Say what you want about him as a president. He's he seems pretty selfish to me. So this whole concept of adding a value to the soul of an individual, depending on what his or her circumstances are, is tricky business
yes.
because I really do understand both sides, right? It's like, how could you say you're better than me just because you were born in America, white, male, and your parents have 10 million in the bank? What makes you better? The answer is nothing. But they have a better opportunity to make something of that money,
Hmm.
of themselves. They have a better chance. That doesn't mean they deserve it more or less, but they do have a better chance. I mean, I don't think we can argue about that. I mean, we could get into the nuances of as of why, but in terms of just being able to expend resources to be given opportunities, there's more opportunities.
Absolutely. And I think that this is actually an issue, hearkening back to our conversation in the Republic with Plato. Plato really just said, like if we follow Plato's advice, I think everything is going to be a-okay. We have to listen to this guy. His book has survived for 2,000 years for a reason. And he just simply says, aspire to be in the guardian, for those who want to be guardians, for those who want to be the caretakers of our civilization,
Mhm.
please do so. We need people like you. However, every generation has to be judged by according to its own merits. And Plato specifically says that the guardian class can compose of people who come from the wealthy or come from the working class. It's really up for us as a society to create the pathways and the vehicles for future rulers to come from all walks of life. And that's if we
Mhm.
follow that advice. Again, the people on the radical left will tell us, everything must be equal. Doctors and janitors must be living in the same house together as brothers. I'm like, no, no, no. Listen, radical left guy, you don't know what you're talking about. Like that's not right at all. No one's actually saying that. What we are saying that is that someone who's born in the poorest tiers of America should have some kind of road that they can travel to so that they can be a part of the guardian class, do well, and have influence and do well for themselves. And then their child may continue that on, or they may not. But it has to be, and the parent has to be fundamentally okay with that. And that's justice. Like we all need to be, like, again, this is what Plato said. Plato said don't put compassion as your highest virtue. Put justice as your highest virtue. If you make justice your highest virtue, you won't find any of these problems, because everyone will be like, hey, sorry, you didn't make the baseball team. You just didn't deserve to be there. You weren't good enough. You don't have a good right arm. You just don't belong to be on the baseball team. I love you, son. You're just not going to make it on to the New York Yankees. And if we have that fundamental, the way that, and with sports, it's very fair, right? We know if someone's good at basketball. We know when someone's a
Right.
good runner. We know when someone's a good baseball player. And we just tell, hey, look, I'm only 5'8". People were like, dude, you're not going to play for the Knicks. That's the end of the story. And it's like that kind of like blunt honesty is what we need in all spheres of life. And I think once we get closer to that idea of justice, once we're there touching justice, a lot of these problems are going to fix themselves.
Wow. Well said.
I think this is this is obviously a very sensitive topic for a lot of people. We're at a turning point right now, because again, I study a lot of public policy, the Gini coefficients, all of these metrics that we have that show indicators of inequality. They're way up. We're losing our middle class. We're losing the bedrock ideals of this country. They are completely falling apart. I'm not here to take anyone's mansion away. I'm not here to take away something that somebody is proud of or worked really hard to get. That's not what I'm about. What I am asking is that we have to, each of us has to sacrifice just a bit more to make this system fair and just. If we stop seeing this as a war between the rich and the poor, or any of
Right.
these kind of like French, like hyperbole French Revolution kind of like acronyms, and we start seeing this as just a pursuit for justice and fairness, we can solve this problem, my friend. We really can. But it's really the pursuit of justice that's the answer to this.
So I'm curious, like, what do you think would be a good creative exercise that could be instilled in public education that would make that obtainable for people? Maybe literally playing out court situations, some sort of class about justice, because I
Yeah.
think what you're saying is incredibly accurate and very well put. Justice should be primary in every person's personality structure. It
Yes.
should be, because I mean, I just don't know any other way to have a reasonable citizen base.
I think one of the things that happens is that I think if you tackle inequality, you actually remove some of the fear. And the reason why inequality brings so much fear is because it's all or nothing. You're either super rich or you're super poor. It's like, oh well, if you don't play your cards exactly right, you're going to be out there, on the breadlines. So one thing that you can kind of do is have a strong, robust middle class. If most people are middle class, well, the rich don't have to worry all that much anymore, because if you are a rich man and your son doesn't do exactly what you want your son to do, the worst thing that will happen is like, okay, my son will just be like an upper middle class guy or whatever, no big deal, like it's not that bad. But if you live in a society that's so stratified, well, then there's all this fear of like, oh my God, either you're the next king or you're going to be on the breadline. So having that middle class investment is really going to be key to bringing about justice. If most people see, like, there was this idea, and it was a staple of our thought process in America, especially in the late 40s and 1950s and early 60s, that if you worked a 40-hour job, you had a house, a Levittown house. It wasn't a
Right.
beautiful mansion. It was just as anyone else. And what that basically did is that's a psychological buffer of like, okay, the worst thing that's going to happen to me in this world is I'm just going to be like everyone else and have a 3-bedroom house, and like my kids will go to a pretty decent school. Maybe my kid will work really hard and move up. Maybe they won't. Like the worst thing that can happen is that I'll just continue working 40 hours a week and be middle class.
Mhm.
What has happened in this country is, and this is again how we've moved away from justice, is that like if you don't have 5 master's degrees and in the STEM fields, then
Right.
then you are destined to be on a breadline. And that's the all or nothing psychology of the way that the country has been set up. And once we fix that, the stakes won't be as high. If you lose your job, the stakes aren't as high. If you pick the wrong, quote unquote, the wrong major, the stakes aren't that high. If you start investing in public schools, well, now you've given some of the poor people a chance to actually learn stuff. You've actually given them a chance to learn about chemistry. You've given them a chance to learn about science, and they have actually a fair crack at getting a decent paying job, or you've given them a fair crack at studying the legal profession, or doing something worthwhile with their lives. And risk is all about how high, like the more you risk to lose, the worse it gets, and the more fear is induced. And I'm actually making a plea to our richest brothers and sisters out there and saying, listen, guys, if you want the paranoia to stop, if you want the hate to stop, it's really in your hands. If we return to the tax rates of the 1950s and 60s, a lot of these problems will go away. You're still going to be incredibly wealthy. You're still going to be incredibly well-to-do, and you'll still drive nice sports cars. You'll be just fine, I promise you. And what will happen is that if you're the mental strain and the mental anguish that's existing within your family will start to diminish, because you'll say to yourself, great, my daughter's doing this and she's happy and she lives in a decent house. So if we come back to that, and we come back to that pursuit of justice, this world is going to be quite amazing, my friend. And I'm optimistic. I know that we can get there.
It's inspiring. It really is.
Thank you, my friend. This concludes the 112th episode of the Truth Island podcast. I'm Aaron Azrod.